countryside which in the 1840s gave every impression of destitution and poverty. A period when there were no certainties about survival. Only the knowledge that a cabin and a piece of land might, with luck, marginally sustain a family. It was a potato economy. There were some fields of profitable grain, but they did not belong to those who most needed them. Outside the town, the population lived what ought to have been a life of modest comfort in isolated cabins, many of them at that time no larger than a single room. Along the approach roads to the town, a visitor would have seen hundreds of ramshackle thatched cottages, indicating that Ennis was a very poor town indeed. Finding a living in the countryside impossible, large numbers of families moved to the fringes of the town in search of employment which was no longer to be found there. They built their wretched cabins from whatever stone or mud was nearest to hand. Inside, the smell of wet turf, the rain seeping through the thatch, the inhabitants in rags, hungry and without hope. Today, the walls that once housed miserable cabins serve to ditch the fields. Habitations torn from the earth out of necessity now crumble back into that selfsame earth. There was a time when the sale of yarn or woven cloth provided just enough extra money to avoid destitution. But weaving and spinning in County Clare were rapidly declining, and whole families were thrown into unemployment. Although Ennis was a poor town, it had then a remarkably high population, about 10,000, of whom 4,000 lived in growing poverty on the approach roads. The population indeed was growing fast, while at the same time the town's industries were disappearing, if not dead. The people relied on the potato, and if the potato failed, widespread suffering would be inevitable. The town and its surrounding countryside could hardly have been in a worse position to meet an impending disaster. And when the potato crop did fail, there was no way to avoid what was to come. No escape from fever and famine, nowhere to go but into the place which meant a death to pride and an end to hope, the Ennis workhouse. The workhouse sheltered the victims of the famine, and later it was to become the county home. Ancestors of the travelling people may well have been among its 3,500 inmates in 1851. 3,542 inmates, destitute and hopeless. Now, a century and a quarter later, the old building is being demolished. It and the broken cabins relate directly to Ennis at the time of the Great Famine. At the 1851 census, there are about 1,600 families in the town, and of these we know that over 1,000 were destitute. The real effect of the famine was felt in the years which immediately followed it, as the population of the town began to fall and the number of houses diminished. The long lines of cabins on the approach roads began to disappear. Yet in the center of the town there was little change. Industry was as good as dead, but the town continued to be a commercial center. The workhouse was always dreaded in the countryside. It meant the end of the road for so many who deserved better. The Ennis workhouse in particular had seen the dreadful toll of the famine. Just at that time, a very different sort of building was going up in Ennis, a new courthouse. The most dignified of Ennis's public buildings, opened in 1850. Testimony to the fact that this broken, sad town was nonetheless the political and administrative center for County Clare. With money enough to build this courthouse in 1850, just at the time the workhouse was sheltering all those thousands of miserably destitute. Justice, it seemed, came before humanity in those days. Life was very much a series of black and white alternatives. To die at home or sail to America. To eat the potato or not eat at all. To die slowly in a rotten cabin or slightly less slowly in the workhouse. Or one could concern oneself with politics, although very few tenants bothered to do that. Not at least until the advent onto the Ennis scene of a man whose personality and eloquence enlivens the courthouse and indeed the whole of Ireland, and whose memorial dominates the town centre, reminding us again that Ennis has always had a tradition of politics. No less than its tradition of commerce and trade, and increasingly too a new tradition as a communication centre. The railway reached Ennis in 1859 from Limerick, and now passengers from that city could come in style to Ennis by rail. Mail car routes radiated to various parts of the county. And the building of the West Clare Railway between 1885 and 1892 was good for trade also. The West Clare may have been ridiculed in Percy French's famous song, "Are you right there, Michael, are you right?" But it did create something of a revolution nonetheless in the region. Villagers along the coast who had depended on the town of Kilrush could now bring themselves and their produce to Ennis by rail. The railway is still of great importance to Ennis. The character of Ennis has changed greatly indeed since Thackeray called it a busy little, narrow-streeted, foreign-looking town. The courthouse was located on the north side of the Fergus, and the railway station, built in 1859, was to the east of the old jail, now the Old Ground Hotel. Increased traffic from the station made this an important road. Before the famine, the Catholic Pro Cathedral had already been built here. Indeed, most of the major religious buildings and public institutions of the town were built around this time, in the decades in the middle of the last century, before and after the Great Famine. Besides the courthouse and the workhouse, which we've already seen, and the Franciscan church on the causeway, a great mental asylum was built outside the town on the north side, while in 1858 the Christian Brothers opened their school on the new road opposite the courthouse. To the north of the Fergus, all this development appeared between 1830 and 1860. Hitherto, the river had prevented growth to the north, but a new bridge at the mills, built in 1830, opened up new possibilities. Off the road which developed from this bridge, the very fashionable cul-de-sac Bindon Street was built in 1832. A street in the Georgian mode, it is not quite long enough to offer a decent perspective. It is now the professional street of the town. The bridge at the Abbey was rebuilt in '65, and the remainder of the road was developed. Bindon Street now ended nowhere. Access to the town centre was by the roundabout route down to the Abbey and up Abbey Street. What was clearly needed was another bridge over the Fergus here. This, in fact, was built in 1861, joining the end of Bindon Street, the cul-de-sac, directly to the town centre. The new street developed rapidly as the financial centre of the town and is known as Bank Place. At the corner of Bindon Street and Bank Place, a new Protestant church was built in 1869. One other building of note on the north side is the Erasmus Smith School, dating from a century earlier, 1763. It was, in turn, an important school, a centre for Belgian refugees during the First World War, and is now a Convent of Mercy secondary school. Before the end of the century, about 1880, St. Flannan's Seminary was built on the Limerick-Clare Castle Road. The area now shaded on the aerial photograph represents the shape of Ennis around about 1900. The life of the town had indeed changed a great deal in the half-century since the famine. Most of the small local industries, such as malting and distilling, chandling and tanning, had entirely disappeared. The remaining unshaded areas of the town on the photograph represent new housing development, while outside the scope of the photograph altogether, and fringing the town, new factories have appeared on the east and northern sides, with the result that the old town, like so many others, is now ringed by new industrial and housing estates. There are two main reasons for this resurgence of Ennis. The first is the town's proximity to Shannon Airport with its industry and tourism, and the second is that new industries are attracted to Ennis by government financial incentives. Accompanying the growth and development of the town now is perhaps necessarily the decay of the old town centre. Much of the area behind Parnell Street, for example, has been cleared for car parks. The rear too of Abbey Street, behind James Leach's former great store, has also been cleared. In an adjoining yard, Frank Maloney works as a farrier. On this spot, the site of an old inn, horses have been shod for almost 7 centuries. The method hasn't changed much over the years. Yet the hammer and the anvil have all but had their day. In an era of interplanetary travel, this scene with its animal smells and old sounds is curiously incongruous. Frank Maloney succeeded his father here, but his son will not shoe horses.